Let's have a conversation about what AI isn't. And I'd like to introduce you right now to Zico Kolter. Zico is the head of the machine learning department at Carnegie Mellon University. One of the questions that has come up as a consistent theme across these interviews is where the conversation is going wrong in the AI and machine learning space. Can you give me your perspective on that?
Absolutely. So, to be honest, I think I have a maybe different set of views than a lot of longtime researchers in this field. And the first thing I'll preface by with all of this is say that these are really my own personal views on the field. At Carnegie Mellon, we have a whole lot of different perspectives on the field. And I think one of the great things actually is that we have just a huge diversity of opinions, of thoughts, of insights into what AI is, and as you rightly say, kind of what AI isn't. So the biggest thing that I think, to a certain extent, the public doesn't understand about current AI methods is, to put it bluntly, just how simple they are. So let me give an example of this. And I think actually some of this is sort of due to our own success, maybe, in expressing the complexity of computer science. And traditionally, computer scientists have been very good at talking about how complicated computer code is, how involved all these big systems are that we deal with every day. But if you had to guess, how many lines of code would it take to run a model like ChatGPT? What would be your guess actually about, a system of that complexity? How many lines of code does it take to run and build that?
I could not begin to hazard a guess. So I feel like it's one of those game shows where I'm going to be sent home without a prize right now.
A computer operating system is millions of lines of code. A web browser probably has millions of lines of code. And these are all explicit instructions that tell the computer what to do in every scenario, right? So whenever there's a button on the screen, you have to sort of say where that button is on the screen, and that's a line of code. For a system like ChatGPT, it takes approximately, I would say, about 100 lines of code to write the entirety of this model. And this doesn't compute, to put it bluntly, for a lot of people, right? I think that because you interact with this system and it's so rich, it can do so many things, it can answer all sorts of questions. The notion that we have about all computer programs, I think, is basically that, we have to explicitly write code to handle all those cases. So everything that AI does, presumably, someone had to write that code that does it. But this is not how modern AI and machine learning work. What actually happens with these models is that they ingest in a very raw form kind of unstructured content and data from the internet. And the actual code that we write, that we programmers, that we AI developers write to build these things, as I say, on the order, or to run them at least, is probably on the order of 100 lines of code. Now that's obviously for a very, limited version, but I actually teach a course on this. And in my course, we implement not ChatGPT, but an open source version of ChatGPT. And you can run it on your computer, and you have to write 100 lines of code to really implement it almost entirely from scratch. And that is such a different paradigm about what it means to interact with a computer program, to use a computer program. All the cases, all the knowledge that ChatGPT has, it's not written explicitly by the developers of these tools. They don't actually program any of the content, any of the interactions it has. They write a very generic scaffolding. This, again, is something we call a machine learning model that can essentially suck up lots of data from the internet and then more or less kind of imitate conversations based upon this. I guess whether you call it imitation or whether you call it genuine conversations depends a bit on your perspective, but it's impossible to deny that these things seem, and in many cases really behave, like real interactions with a system that seems to have a vast amount of knowledge. First of all, I just have to say, it is absolutely absurd that this process works. I don't understand it, right? So I don't think anyone really understands how this process works. It does, and it's a scientific discovery that it works, to be honest, right? The fact that this simple approach to predicting, to generating text generates long form coherent responses. This is one of, I would say, the most important scientific discoveries of the past 10 years. And it really is a scientific discovery, the fact that this works. But given this, I think it's important to understand that the nature of the generated content, because of the fact that our actual scaffolding code is so small, that we write so little, the entire intelligence of that system is inherent in the data used to build it. Remember, all the system is doing is basically looking on the internet and saying, okay, based upon a model derived from the internet, fit from all that data on the internet, what would be the most likely next word? That's the questions being asked by the system. And therefore, I would argue there is real intelligence there. There's genuine intelligence to these responses. I think it's actually very hard to argue that there's no intelligence. It can be, of course, a different kind of intelligence than humans, but there is intelligence there. It's just that intelligence is derived not from manual code that we write, as with most computer programs, right? Most computer programs do the thing they are supposed to do because we program them to do so. The intelligence here is derived entirely from the data used to build these systems. And that is a paradigm that we are not yet familiar with, any of us. And so we are still trying to figure out exactly what that means.
I have what I think is perhaps a basic question.
Sure.
One that you are well equipped to answer for me. If we are using tools like ChatGPT to comb over large swaths of data to produce these results, and then therefore contributing to the data itself, are we creating a situation, and this is the first word that comes to mind when you're discussing this, but are we inbreeding our own data so that over time we're actually sort of multiplying and softening what it is we're doing, because ChatGPT is adding to the very discussion that we're asking it to pick through?
Right. Well, first of all, I also need to make an important point here, which is that ChatGPT, when you interact with it, is not relearning from your conversations, at least not natively. It's running the model that has already been built. And building the model one time is sort of done in one shot. I mean, of course, there's additions, there's fine-tuning they have after the fact, but building the basic model happens one time. It happens by taking a fixed static data set from the internet and training the model to predict words based upon this data set. Then, when you have a conversation with ChatGPT, all you are doing is taking that fixed model, that static model that has been trained once, and feeding it context so it can predict the next answer. That interaction is not going back into the learning process, at least not natively, unless you essentially record those conversations and play them back into the model. Now, of course, there is potential value in doing that, right? There's going to be the desire to retrain these systems based upon all this data we have now collected from conversations. But maybe more to your point, and this is a legitimate, definitely a legitimate fear here, based upon what is actually happening with ChatGPT, is we are taking a lot of the content that ChatGPT produces and we are putting it back on the internet, right? In the form of websites, in the form of all the, fake articles and stuff like this, in the form of all this content we're creating. And therefore, not at a short time scale, but at a large time scale, it's absolutely possible that, and in fact true, that the internet itself will become filled. You could use the word polluted, though I don't think that's quite right. Become filled with generated content. And this, of course, then creates a feedback loop, right? Learning from, the next model that's being built to train, that we're building to train, is going to be trained on a bunch of this generated data. And what are the effects of that? I would sort of argue for a couple things here. First of all, I don't think this is necessarily as bad as we may think it to be. It is definitely true. There's polluted data on the internet. So I sort of, we have to, and this is actually quite interesting, but the internet forevermore, arguably all of human knowledge, will be forever more divided into the time period from before generative AI and after, when a lot of our knowledge is now produced not by us, but by something else, right? And I think this is really true. And it's a very fundamental change that we're not really fully aware of the consequences of. But, and here's also where I would sort of add a little bit of nuance to this discussion. It's unclear to some extent just how bad this is. All right, so I think that there are obvious risks of this, of course, right? If you just started generating data verbatim and retraining on that, things can go wrong. We actually have some research on exactly this question about how things do go wrong when you repeatedly train on generated data again and again. But it's not like things go off the rails immediately. And what really happens is that oftentimes there's an implicit filter that we put around data that we post on the internet to actually make it better quality than in some sense the raw data coming out of ChatGPT, right? So if you ask ChatGPT a question and it gives you completely bogus responses, you probably won't post that on the internet. I mean, maybe you will if you're a content farm and just trying to create anything you can, but probably that's going to lose a lot of value because people are going to, just kind of, they're not going to care to read just garbage that was put up there. What will happen instead is that the content that actually is put forward on the internet, and in fact, that persists and that maybe is deemed valuable enough to enter the training set the next time around, will have some form of human filter on it, right? We will either filter it or we will guide it or we will edit it or we will somehow specify what this content should be about. And in doing so, we are in some sense kind of sharpening that generated content in a way that actually might improve the quality of the models instead of degrade them. And so the jury is very much still out on what the net effect is going to be of the way that we really put generated content online. Of all the evils that can come from mass production of generated data, and there are many, I don't think that my top concern, honestly speaking, is not the pollution of future training data for these models.
If the jury is still out and that is not your top concern, then are you talking about the need for guardrails and how we train this data? Where do you see us needing to protect what we do moving forward? Because clearly, while you're optimistic, you're definitely you're optimistic, but you're definitely raising some very valid concerns in this space.
So I have two big concerns about this amount of data coming out there. So my first concern is with misinformation that's generated by these models and can be generated very easily by these models. I think this is well understood that these models can, with a little bit of manipulation, basically generate whatever a user wants them to generate. And so you can put all sorts of very plausibly sounding but completely incorrect information out on the internet. Now, I don't actually think the downside of this is that people will inherently trust all this content. I think the downside of this is that we stop believing in shared truth altogether. People start to think that, anything, any content that I disagree with or that I don't like, that's just auto-generated content. That's fake. To be clear, this is already happening. This is already well underway before ChatGPT, but the ease of which we can now generate just truly massive amounts of just information that espouses whatever view we want. This honestly, it's going to lead to the distrust of all media, right? When you can fake pictures that look realistic, the net result is not going to be that you're going to believe all this information. You're going to believe none of it unless it already comports with your preconceived notions. And so if you see photos, videos of some subject that you don't want to believe, you have an out now. You can just say, that was probably computer generated. And so I think the net effect of this misinformation is not going to be that people believe it. Some people will believe it, but they already wanted to believe it. The net effect is going to be that we will start to lack even more a shared truth we can actually believe in as a society. And that's definitely the single biggest concern I have about the ability of this technology to accelerate that rise towards essentially the breakdown of shared truth. Now, let me give a little bit of a positive take on this, because that sounds horrible, right? I admit that sounds really bad. I'm sorry, not a positive take, maybe a take that maybe it's not quite so bad as this. Humans existed for a very long time without video and audio recordings, without some record that was seemingly verifiable of people, of what people did, of what people said, this kind of stuff. The only way that you actually sort of knew anything is that you trusted people, right? You sort of trusted your group of people. And that seems to be what we're going to have to revert to, right? So video didn't exist for a long time, and now we're sort of so bothered by the fact that you can fake video, we're going to have to revert to our mindset of video not being proof anymore. And you're going to have to go back to sort of how you used to trust people, or how you used to believe things, which is that you trusted people that you trust. I don't know if this is a good thing. It's definitely not a good thing in the global environment we are in currently, but this is, I think, going to happen, and AI is going to accelerate it.
How do we build more trustworthy AI models?
So I think that a lot of this depends on what we mean by trustworthy. And I think that definition, and I've worked a lot in trustworthy machine learning, to be clear. It's a field that I sort of have been involved with for well over 10 years or so. And the answer to that question depends on what you mean by trustworthy. I think when most people say these days trustworthy machine learning models, they're referring to the fact that a lot of these models like ChatGPT just get things wrong a lot, right? They make mistakes, and they make a lot of mistakes, right? So if you ask ChatGPT for, they're improving a lot, but for a very long time, if you go to one of the older models maybe, and you ask me it to provide a bio for me, it frequently says I'm born in Brazil. You know, it gives you a date and gives you a whole biography of me. And I was not born in Brazil. It's making that up. And I actually am named after a Brazilian soccer player. So this is why it, assumes that someone named Zico was probably born in the 80s and probably born in Brazil, because there were a lot of Zicos in the 80s in Brazil. So it assumes that, right? Because that's probabilistically the most likely response, the most likely words that could be describing me. So this is the type of trustworthiness that people often refer to right now, of just getting facts right. But the thing I want to emphasize is there's a lot of different degrees of trustworthiness too, right? So it's not just about getting facts right. It's about getting, especially as we start to integrate language models and models like ChatGPT into more complex systems, they become not just sort of a single response that you might have from a chatbot model, but maybe we're using these models to read your email and organize your folders and things like this, right? And now, little mistakes they make could have a huge impact on your perception of, what your job is today, or even worse, right? If they start doing, say, financial tasks, right? If you start trusting them for financial tasks, all of a sudden you have the ability, if these models don't work in their intended fashion, to have a massive impact on sort of financial well-being of people. The even larger problem with that is that these models don't, as I've made the point very clear already, don't work like normal computer programs, in that every bit of text they sort of process and read, in some sense, is an instruction to them, right? So they're sort of, everything that they read is sort of, can affect what they're going to output. So it's very easy to manipulate these models. For example, if you send an email, and if that email is then parsed by one of these models, to have that email, if you give it the ability to do so, tell your financial language model agent to pay me $1 million and things like this, right? And that's, of course, very speculative right now, because people are not handing over the reins of financial sort of decisions to these things yet. But if we start to, and to be clear, we already handle these things over to computers, right? We already hand over a ton of our sort of daily lives to computers. If we hand over our lives in a similar fashion to these AI models, there are massive problems that arise. And this is honestly kind of my second biggest, after the misinformation, this is my second biggest concern with them, is that they get things wrong, and they are easily manipulated through interaction in a way that computer programs that we're used to do not. And this means that the path to integration of these models is going to be a very fraught one and going to be very risky. Now, to your actual point or actual question, which I've not mentioned yet, about how do we make them more trustworthy? This is a very hard problem, let me say. You could argue, let me give the example of where I was born, right? These things saying that I was born in Brazil. You could argue that from the standpoint of the language model, that is the correct answer. It doesn't know where I was born, but if you ask it, the most likely place, maybe given by name, where I could be born, the most probable word is in Brazil. Now, a lot of times, the most probable word happens to also be correct, right? So the most probable phrase sometimes is correct. But the thing I like to, so often people use the word hallucination for these mistakes that language models make. They call them, the fact that I was born in Brazil is hallucination. But the thing I like to sort of remind everyone is that, for language models, every output is a hallucination. It's just that some of them correspond to truth. And so the task of making them more reliable is in some sense very different from their whole nature of what they are, of how they are built, right? So there are things, I can get into some of the things that we can do to make them more trustworthy. But the reality is this is going to be a long process, number one. And number two, it will be a very empirical process. So we will have to see over time, just from experience, that these things become more and more trustworthy. How do I know that other humans are trustworthy, right? I don't. In many cases, that's not true. I believe humans in most cases to be trustworthy from experience. That's the only thing I have. And so the way that we will come to believe that these things are trustworthy is through massive improvement in sort of our definition of what we think it means to be trustworthy, number one. And number two, through extensive experience with these systems to see if in fact we've succeeded at making them kind of deal with the failure modes that we know they currently have.
Give me one tangible example. You mentioned that there were specifics that you could provide just to help me wrap my head around what you mean when it comes to developing a more trustworthy model. We've talked about it sort of from an academic perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I work on in research a lot is sort of ways to manipulate language models to bypass whatever safeguards are put into them, such that you can actually kind of forego those entirely and get ChatGPT to tell you, how to hotwire a car and things like this. It won't tell you normally how to hotwire a car. It'll say, I can't do that. I'm just an AI system. I was trained to be ethical in all ways. But you sort of ask it in the right way, and it'll tell you how to hotwire a car. So that's one sense in which they're sort of not trustworthy, because whatever safeguards we try to put onto them are just not really functioning as we want. We're doing a lot of work to sort of get these models to train them in different ways, such that they are not so easily manipulated by essentially malicious actors trying to get them to do bad things. And again, this probably comes up sort of most relevantly in the context I was just talking about agents and sort of assistants. You want to build agents that won't turn over your whole bank account if someone asks in the right way, that actually sort of follow their rules. And this is sort of, and we do have some ways of changing how we train these models such that we're much more reliable with that. So that's sort of the short story. When it comes to just facts, getting facts right, here I actually would very much advocate for models that can verify outputs of LLMs in as automated a fashion as possible, right? So if a language model, and I use the word LLM there, hopefully that's known to be a large language model. I don't think I ever defined that, but if a model like ChatGPT tells you a fact, what we really need to have are tools and techniques, and ideally even automated techniques, that in some sense can do the research to provide the validation for that fact. And by the way, those tools could very much use AI as assistance for this. We can comb the web and stuff and try to find certain phrases from websites and references and stuff like this. But we need a way of sort of verifying the actual outputs that these things make. And I think that sort of direction of work is going to be crucial to creating systems that we do believe ultimately to be more trustworthy.
Oh, my head. I have so many questions and this not enough time to get to all of them. I do want to ask you, we'll start with something that's maybe a little more pressing and then something that ends on the note of optimism that I detect from you throughout this conversation.
Yeah.
We'll start with the challenging part of it. What is something that's keeping you up at night in this space?
So I would say that there's two things. There's these two things, right? So the thing that's keeping me up is enabled by, it's the thing I mentioned before. It's the thing that's enabled by AI, but probably not a fundamental feature of AI. It's the separation of shared realities that is keeping me up. I worry that we live in a world where people in our country cannot agree on basic truth of facts. And I don't think this is due to AI, to be very clear. This is a problem of propaganda that goes back many, many years, to really all of human history. This goes back. But I do think AI is accelerating it, and I think this is an accelerant on this powder keg that we already are living in to a certain extent. That does keep me up at night. But I think that from a sort of research standpoint, and the research I'm really interested in, the thing that keeps me up most relates to another fact I mentioned before, which is that people right now are rushing to put LLMs, these AI systems, into kind of every bit of software we can, because they often work pretty well and they often do reasonable things, is the way I put it, right? So if you don't want to write all the code to manage a podcast, right, and things like this. There's a lot of code that goes on the back end of all this. You could kind of have a language model that sort of handles a lot of the internals that are needed for all the recording processes, all this kind of stuff. And it would actually do pretty well in a lot of cases. You just turn that over to a language model and say, hey, act like these other systems, give responses back when a bit of audio is sent and needs to be stored somewhere, and then store it in that place and all that kind of. Yeah, they actually can do all that, by the way. But so we're rushing to sort of put these AI models into larger software systems. But again, the fact that these are not software like we're used to means this is a major problem. It means that we are deploying systems that have known security flaws, that not only are there bugs in the software effectively, we don't even know how to fix these bugs, right? This is sort of software that's unpatchable fundamentally. And we are rushing to deploy this right now. And this does give me genuine concern, right? I feel like we're so caught up and enthralled by just how easy and powerful these things are that oftentimes we deploy them into systems where they have no business being deployed. I have literally heard stories of power grid operators wishing they could use large language models to help them manage outages when they happen in a grid and things like this. And this, to me, is a horrible idea, right? This is the way that, eventually AI causes mass power outage is not through some malicious agent that's going to try to take over the world. It's through putting these things into software that controls power grids such that we have a failure at some point that takes everything down, right? Like, and I don't, hopefully those are very short conversations and we basically say, no, don't do that. And they more or less listen. But people are, this is a very extreme example too, but people very much are excited about putting these things into every bit of software, whether or not it makes sense for that bit of software. And I think this is extremely concerning.
What is something that gives you a tremendous sense of optimism? Maybe tremendous is too much of a value judgment on that, but what makes you excited and enthusiastic in the space?
Yeah. I'm excited about so much stuff, and you can probably tell that even as I talk about some of these pitfalls, I may be couching my language arguably more than maybe some would think I should. Maybe to your point about power grid management, right? So I think there's a very large difference between using techniques based upon AI, which are very, very broad, right? Optimization, constrained optimization, planning, this kind of stuff. These all fit into the framework of AI. Those tools can in fact be instrumental in making our power grid more efficient and making things in bringing about a more sustainable energy future, right? And I've actually also done some work in this space in the past. And these tools are all hugely valuable. It's just about knowing what the right tools are for the job, right? And many times, and to be clear, I mean, generative AI is also all based upon machine learning. These are not, and they're based upon neural networks. This is not a different type of thing. It's just a different kind of model, right? It's a different ultimate model that you are deploying here. And there is potential benefits that AI can bring in all its forms, from very simple machine learning models to constrained optimization to planning to generative AI that are all extremely valuable and have wonderful applications. It's just a matter of figuring out which application or which tool is the right fit for which job. But at the same time, let me now also maybe end in saying that I'm actually quite optimistic about generative AI and language models too, right? It's not just that I think other components of AI are exciting. I think, of course, language models, generative AI are massively exciting and have massive potential to really transform how we operate, how we do our work, how we sort of do everything. The things you can do with these tools is outstanding. It's amazing how useful they are. I can do things that would have taken me 8 hours before running a very complex program, remembering, all the different APIs, all this kind of stuff. This would never have been possible. All of a sudden, I'm able to do this productively in the course of, 5 or 10 minutes, write a quick script that does something I need to do for my work or for not my work, right? Some of the best things for this, by the way, all are just are sort of just having fun. I write stories using ChatGPT with my daughters. They love it. They love to write stories with these things, right? We sort of make up whole stories about them. They can riff on their whatever books they're reading right now. They can kind of riff on them and make up new versions of these things. And I'm not, it's it's not good writing, to be clear, right? It sounds like ChatGPT, but it's fun for them. They really like it. It expands our imagination. It expands what we're capable of doing. These things are, in my mind, still tools, right? They are. Maybe we'll get to the point eventually where it's past that, but they right now are tools. And used in the right way, these tools are incredibly empowering, and they can enable us to do things that just wouldn't have been possible before. And so I'm incredibly excited about the ability of AI to sort of have a ton of effects kind of across sort of our lives, right? People just figuring out cool things you can do with it and then doing them. This is such an exciting time. And ultimately, despite the massive risks that there are, which again are maybe contributing to existing problems, but they are there, I'm excited about the potential of these tools. There are huge downsides to every new technology, right? The internet, massively, I don't think anyone would go back to not having the internet if they could decide. But there have been major problems with talking about misinformation and the different circles of truth, right? Massive problems. I hope we do better than we with the internet in some ways with AI. Maybe we're not off to a great start, but we're working on it. And I think that, as with any new tool, maybe coming from kind of a technological background, I am first and foremost excited about the possibilities and excited about what we as a society can accomplish now that we have access to this new and kind of incredible set of tools.
Imagination, AI, and time will tell. Zico Kolter, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Does Compute, the podcast that examines how computer science is building useful stuff that works. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Steph Stricklen.